I was finishing up my Friday shift when it all began. Normally, I'd be the last one out of the hospital IT department, housed in an old building on a quiet corner of town. Most of my colleagues had already left, and I was eager to wrap up the week and start the weekend. The hospital walls, usually filled with the sounds of hurried footsteps, conversations, and the constant beep of medical equipment, were eerily silent. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath. I needed to check a server that was housed in a room at the end of the hallway, an area we didn't use much. With all this silence, every sound I made seemed to echo through the empty corridors. My own breath sounded loud in my ears as I walked down the hallway toward the server that needed adjusting. As I approached, I noticed that the door, which should have been locked, was ajar. That was odd enough, but I pushed it aside and entered anyway. The room was cold, colder than usual, and I could see my breath in the air. I thought the air conditioning might be malfunctioning, but upon checking, someone had actually set it incorrectly. I flicked on the light, but only one of the bulbs flickered and remained on, leaving most of the room in darkness. I approached the server, which sat on a corner table, with most of the table shrouded in darkness. I started working on the server, the only sound audible being the click of my fingers on the keyboard. As I delved into the technical routine, a subtle noise broke the monotony of the keyboard clicks. It was an almost imperceptible sound, like the soft drag of something smooth across the floor behind me. I stopped typing, held my breath for a moment, trying to identify what I had heard. After a brief moment of silence, I heard another sound, but this time it was different. It sounded like a low laugh, almost a chuckle, but very soft. I turned slowly and then looked around, trying to find a logical source for the sound. But there was no one else in the room but me. I tried to get back to work, telling myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But then, something much worse happened. Suddenly, in the almost complete silence of the room, a soft whisper cut through the air. It was a child's voice, sweet and clear, and it seemed to come from very close by, almost as if someone were right beside me. The whisper continued, a twisted lullaby that was anything but comforting. And the worst part was that I realized at that moment that my body and feet were frozen. But then the sound stopped, and shortly after, I heard the sound of something falling to the floor, a seemingly metallic object. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the shadow of the stretcher we used to transport equipment. The whisper and the noise made me lose control. I ran out of the room, not wanting to spend another second in that place. In the hallway, still panting, I called my supervisor, who, concerned by my frightened voice, called security. They searched the place, but of course, found nothing. No child, no sign of anyone hiding, or any explanation for what I had heard. That was my last night in that hospital. After what happened, I couldn't imagine going back into that room. Some things just don't have explanations, and I preferred to leave that mystery unsolved. I had never experienced true fear until that day. My job of cleaning pools is routine. I spend most afternoons dealing with chlorine and water, and usually that's all there is to it. To keep me company, a good podcast on my headphones is usually enough. But that visit to the farmhouse was different, outside of my usual routine, and the vibe started to change as soon as I arrived. The property was located far away, in an isolated area I had never been to before. The dirt roads to get there were full of tight curves and tall grass on both sides. When I finally arrived, the sun was already setting behind old, tall trees that surrounded the place. The path to the main entrance was covered in dry leaves that crackled under my feet. The house was an old, but beautiful wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around the entire building. The windows were large and dark, reflecting the little light left in the sky, giving the impression that something or someone was always watching. I dropped my equipment on the ground with a dull thud and went to the pool to start working. The pool was a bit away from the house, in a part of the yard that was less maintained. Dead leaves floated on the surface of the water, which was murky and full of small insects. The pool seemed not to have seen a cleaning net for months. I started my work, the water darkening more and more as night fell. I prepared the pool vacuum and dipped the hose into the cold water, and that's when I heard it for the first time. David! My spine chilled, not out of fear, but because of the strangeness of the situation. The female voice sounded sweet, as if she were right beside me. I looked around, expecting to see some resident I hadn't noticed before, but all I saw were the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I continued my work, thinking I had imagined it at the moment, or that maybe it was the audio from my headphones playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, clearer and closer. David couldn't ignore it. I took off my headphones, my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. I looked up at the house, and my heart almost stopped. There she was, a dark silhouette against the faint glow coming from the windows of the house. A tall, long-haired female figure. She stood there, just watching me. I knew I should scream or run, but my feet felt as fixed to the ground as the dead leaves of that autumn. She called my name once more, and that sweetness in her voice now had a touch of something else, something that made me freeze inside. With an effort I didn't know I had, I called back, "Who's there?" But as expected, I got no answer. The figure just slowly retreated until she disappeared completely into the darkness of the house. With heavy breathing and reason trying to overcome fear, I forced myself to go to the house. Each step seemed to take me further away from safety. I searched the place, expecting at any moment to feel a hand on my shoulder or hear my name being called again. But there was no one. Nothing but the echo of my own footsteps on the old wooden floors. I returned to the pool, the night now completely closed around me. I finished my work in tense silence, startling at every shadow that crossed the light from my flashlight. When I finally finished, I packed up my equipment with trembling hands, cast one last glance at the house, and promised myself never to return. When I told others about it, I downplayed what happened, saying that loneliness and darkness must have played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew that night at the farmhouse had been real, and the fear I feel every time I think about it is as real as the water I was cleaning in that pool. Even now, safe in my own home, I sometimes find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if that voice will call me again. It was a calm evening, somewhat unusual for the usual bustle of the city. My mother, always practical with her days filled between work and home, had the habit of going to bed early. I, on the other hand, a voracious reader, took advantage of these quiet moments to dive into the pages of some novel or mystery, accompanied only by the gentle ticking of the clock and sometimes the distant cars on the street. That night, the living room was warm and cozy, the soft light of the lamp aiding me as I sunk into the couch with a thriller in hand. I was so engrossed in the story that I nearly jumped when I heard the noise of something falling in the kitchen. It was a glass which had fallen by itself. Reluctantly leaving the plot behind, I went to check. There were no open windows, no drafts. The kitchen was just as we had left it after dinner. Finding everything in order, I returned to my reading, but the peace had been disturbed. I tried to reconnect with the story in the book, but my mind was now more attuned to the sounds of the house than to the words on the page. And so the night went on, with me half reading, half listening, until I decided it was time to head to my room, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. The silence of the night was profound, and I could only hear the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it for the first time, a soft creak, as if someone were pressing their weight against the wooden floor. My room is on the second floor, so any such noise is abnormal. My heart raced as I tried to find a more logical explanation. Perhaps it was just the house settling, I thought. But the sounds continued, increasing in frequency, and then a scratch. It was distinct, the sound of nails against wood or something similar. I got up, unsure if I really wanted to investigate. Every step I took toward the source of the noise seemed to resonate through the entire room. The sound suddenly stopped when I finished approaching. I turned on the lights, and all I saw was the room exactly as I had left it before lying down. But the feeling of not being alone was consuming me. The next morning, I told my mother about the sounds. She listened, but her skeptical smile made me give up trying to convince her. The next night, I decided to stay awake again, waiting, as if I could choose to sleep anyway. The noises started earlier, and this time there was clarity in the pattern, as if something or someone was moving uncontrollably. I was scared, but my curiosity prevailed. I sat on the bed, waiting for the courage. Then, something new. The sound of heavy breathing that wasn't mine. I quickly turned on the light, but there was nothing visible. That frightened me so much that I tried for several nights to notice something to prove to my mother. But no more incidents occurred after that night. The feeling of a presence and the acceptance that not everything can be explained remained with me. Now, even on calm nights, there is always a part of me that listens attentively, waiting for the sounds to begin again, barely able to read once I realize I am again trying to listen for something. I didn't expect my journey along the U.S. coastline to lead me to that gas station coffee shop, nestled on a forgotten road between Maine and Georgia. My gas was running low, and the need for a place to stretch my legs and have a hot coffee was becoming more urgent. That's when I saw it, almost hidden by the fog of the evening that was beginning to fall, the rusty sign of a gas station. With few options, I decided to stop. The station and its gas pumps looked old, and the faded sign reading coffee in crooked, weather-worn letters as well. I drove slowly over the uneven asphalt to the empty parking lot, except for an old truck that seemed to have been there for years. I got out of the car, shrinking into my coat as it blew coldly. In front of me was the coffee shop of the place, a low building that looked as old as any other roadside joint. Inside, it smelled of old coffee, mold, and burnt oil, but somehow, that even made me feel a bit better, like a relief in this abandoned place. As I approached the counter, I noticed that the place seemed to have stopped in time. There was a layer of dust on the tables and the floor was sticky and worn. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired, uninterested eyes, barely lifted his gaze at me as he grabbed the coffee cup. "Be careful, the sounds of the night tend to be louder here," he murmured, his tone as empty as his gaze. While I drank my coffee, I heard a strange noise coming from outside, as if something large was dragging on the asphalt. I looked out the window, but only saw darkness swallowing the road. I thought I saw something move quickly out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. The tension began to grow when I realized there were no cameras around. The isolation of the coffee shop and the indifference of the cashier made me uncomfortable. I asked for more details about the sounds, but he just shrugged, mentioning that sometimes he heard footsteps outside. "And don't worry about Jack in the corner," he said, pointing to a dark corner of the coffee shop. I turned, but saw no one. When I asked about Jack, he just smiled and went back to his work. I finished my coffee, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. However, when I stood up to throw away my cup, I again saw something moving out of the corner of my eye. This time, when I looked, I could see a very tall figure, taller than a normal human, standing in the corner the cashier had pointed to earlier. It seemed to be dressed in dark rags, almost blending with the shadows of the wall. My heart raced as that thing, moved one of its long arms toward me. I couldn't see its face, nor am I sure it had one, just darkness where there should have been one. Terror took over me, a primitive and powerful sensation, making my survival instinct scream for me to get out of there. I ran to my car, speeding away from the station while the sound of something dragging grew more distant. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that coffee shop. All I know is that on dark, lonely nights, I avoid stopping in places where the world seems forgotten. I was 10 years old when it all began, during that time when innocence still makes us question whether the monsters in the closet are just figments of our imagination. I lived with my mother and two brothers in an old wooden house that creaked with every stronger breeze. My room, the smallest in the house, was on the first floor, next to my mother's room. I shared it with my books and toys, and a bed that took up almost all the space. It was a cloudy Tuesday afternoon, the wind blowing outside, creating an atmosphere that could only be described as gloomy. I was alone in my room doing homework while my mother prepared dinner and my brothers played outside. The silence of my room was only interrupted by the ticking of the clock and the occasional creaking of the house. Then I started to hear footsteps. At first, the steps were so soft that I doubted my own ears. It must be the house, I thought, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or the old timbers settling. I continued leaning over my books, scribbling down the answers to my math homework. However, I soon heard it again. This time, there was no denying it. They were footsteps, clear and distinct, as if someone was really walking upstairs. My heart sped up a bit, my hand stopping in the middle of a number. The sound seemed to come from the attic or perhaps from within the walls themselves, which was absurd, but how else could it be explained? The footsteps continued, persistent, rhythmic, louder, and more defined. It seemed as if whoever it was walked back and forth, right above where I was sitting. Fear began to settle in, silent, cold, as I tried in vain to ignore it and return to my studies. But each new step that echoed pulled me away from the pages of the book and made me stare at the ceiling, wondering who or what could be causing such noise. I grabbed a flashlight, determined to investigate. My 10 years of life had not prepared me for the fear I felt. A chill in my belly, a hesitation before each step I took towards the sound. I climbed onto a chair and pressed my ear against the wall. The noise was clearer, definitely coming from inside the walls. I called for my mother, my voice trembling slightly, and just as she arrived, the noise diminished. She came, listened carefully, but did not seem convinced. "It's just the house making noise, dear," she said, trying to reassure me. But I knew it wasn't just that. Something was wrong, very wrong. That night, I tried to sleep, but the footsteps continued. keeping me awake, alert. When I finally fell asleep, it was a light sleep, filled with restless dreams. The next day, the same thing, and the next, a whole week of footsteps, whispers that only I seemed to hear, and a growing feeling that I was not alone. After a week, my mother finally relented and let me sleep in her room. But even away from my room, I could hear, in the silence of the night, the distant sound of someone walking where no one should be. A week later, my mother insisted that I return to my room. I went back, reluctantly and scared, but the footsteps had ceased. I spent a few more years in that house and never heard anything again. But I never forgot the fear, the feeling of being watched by something I could not see. To this day, I wonder what those footsteps were, who or what was there with me.